we're gonna go get started. Hello, my name is Jen Nelson. For those of you who haven't seen me before, I know awesome. Quite a few lately. But I am OSB, I'm a board development specialist. And I have also served as a board secretary of city councils and school boards for about 2 decades. I spent a lot of time sitting on the sidelines and talking with my new board members and all of my veteran board members about certain things that are going on. I'm always kind of whispering on the side, we can do that, yes, we can do that, you know, that kind of stuff. Now I actually get up in front and I try and help all of you with this job that you're taking on, and that we really appreciate the volunteer your time to do and continue your screens in your district to try and fill these positions. One of the things I just want to kind of start off with saying, I know that we have some potential new board members in the back here joining us. I think it's great that you get to kind of see a little bit about the things that the board members are getting trained on a regular basis once they become board members. I think that oftentimes we don't know what we're supposed to do as board members until we get on board, and then it's kind of drinking from the fire hose. Everything's coming in every direction, and I know it's a lot of time challenge to figure out, like, okay, I'm a parent in this district, and now I'm a board member, and I have different hats that I wear. It's really difficult to know when, you know, certain hats can on or off throughout your day, especially in a smaller town where you see a lot of people walking in their faces. It's really difficult to decide when you're supposed to be wearing one hat or the other. So it's okay, typically we go through this stuff and we learn a lot of information. And you don't really get to apply it until something comes up that's similar to something that we're talking about. I know that the lawyers often tend to tell you, these are the laws that we need to follow. But then there's that side of going, well, how do we do that? How do we check all these boxes and make sure that, you know, those things are being taken care of, and that we're following them as well. We do practice of our school districts and our board meetings. So that's what I'm doing today, to try and refill a couple of training gaps that we might have had. That we know that we've had some board governance such as this year. We've done some strategic planning. We've gone over some scenarios similar to what I'm going to come up with later on in the training. But this is just a new deeper dive into some of those scenarios that we talked about when we did our board governance sessions for those who've got part of the new mandatory training from the Oregon Government Ethics Commission, we had some public meeting law updates. So I think they're not confusing enough already. A lot of things have changed. And those changes, we've been doing things a certain way for so many years. It's kind of hard to remember what all those different changes are, about how we're in those meetings, what things are supposed to be done inside and outside of meetings, what actual governing bodies or which meetings should be following public meeting laws, which means that they're following public meeting laws. They have a whole bunch of different things they have to take care of. We have to make sure we notice. We have to make sure that we're reporting, that we provide a space for people to join online somehow virtually. They can't be here in person. And we also have status reporting that we post later. That's kind of like the basics of some of the changes that I increase. And we've always had minutes, but there are some different things with minutes that we haven't always been covering. So there's some changes that are making sure. And it's been a learning curve for everybody who's involved in the school board business. Our legal team created a new webinar, which we're going to go through and have. I'm going to have you watch it tonight. It's part of the mandatory training that our piece is required. We've been approved as trainers for that public meeting law updates and changes. However, for development specialists, if you're not lawyers, we have not been approved to get that training. So I'm going to allow our legal team to go ahead and give it to you. If any questions come up that I feel I can't answer without giving legal advice because I'm not a lawyer, I will be making some notes of those, any clarifications you need on what you see in this training, and I'll take it back to our legal team. I'll get some of the answers and I'll share them with you afterwards, just to make sure that whatever messages that they are trying to get out there and that we've been approved about them is actually necessary for the principal. After we watch this webinar, we go through our public meetings, do's and don'ts, and the updates to those laws. We're going to do some scenario work because, as I said, we don't know how to apply these things until things come up. So a really great way to practice and talk about that as a board is put yourself in scenarios that are safe, because if not you actually in the scenario, and then talk about how you handle it if it happens. So with that, any questions?
Can we go around and introduce ourselves?
Yep. Okay. I'd love to do that because I do see some new faces. I've already introduced myself, so want me to go ahead and start again?
Dale King, Sweet Home Board Member.
Can you tell me how long you've been on the board? Just to remind me.
About 12, 13 years.
Mary Speck, also known as Mary Massey. And this is my start of my third year.
Terry Martin, superintendent.
Julie, I'm the board secretary. I've been the board secretary for 12 years. And then this is here for 26.
Matt Brandon, Director of Student Services.
And Barbara Grace, I'm the director of teaching.
My name is Matthew Bechtel, community member in Canada.
Maybe counties, maybe member. Maybe member in Canada.
Rachel Maynard since July.
New one.
Willie Newswander, like Mary, start my third year.
Mike Adams, little more than 6, dating back to 2011.
This is great, because one of the other things I want to let you know is that since this is required training, I am taking your names off because there will be some more information. Oh, there'll be some more information. I changed. In the webinar about how you document it. I don't have any certificates or anything like that to hand out to you when you have this training, but it is one thing that you have to have per term. So there will be some instructions that you can kind of take a picture. I'm taking down your name so I can also say, hey, they've attended this as well, so I can put it in my records.
So I have a quick question, just clarifying. This is a public meeting, and so is it being recorded?
Mhm.
Okay, and then who is it that called for this training?
It's
I'm
part of
I'm
it.
curious.
It was called for in the last board meeting. It's
That
part
was
of-
my understanding. Is that
So
you decided-
this was called as a result of the vote that was taken.
The vote taken included getting OSB training on public meetings.
Okay. So. I'm very confused by the like that we're here. Is this something that the school board has decided today, I mean, for it to be
This,
today?
this is the remedial training that we told the government ethics committee that we would do as part
Did you
of
say it was
this.
mandatory?
Well, so this typical training, what you're doing here today, this webinar itself is part of the new mandatory requirements for board member training for any board members in Oregon. It, once per term, they have to have public meetings training. I don't know if you've had it before or not within your term, but this is one of the things that would be required for you to take within your 4-year term. That's not the reason I was asked to be here to give you the mandatory training, but I'm just letting you know that this does suffice to go towards that requirement. Kind of like you get Leadership Institute credit with us too, when you have board governance essentials, there's certain different things that you can take in that, and it goes towards the Leadership Institute as well.
I just wanted to be on record that I have some formal complaints that have been filed with the district regarding the last board meeting and the way that it was conducted. It's my understanding it's gone to legal and there will be an investigation. I will stay for the training, but I'm doing it under protest. Because I have complaints that are being filed with regard to the way that the last meeting was conducted.
And I'm sure that
Great.
that's something that would be brought up on board business. This is just a work session, which is the training, but that just means it's kind of a little more formal and open, but we still have to follow the public meeting laws. That is going to be on the record. And it is recorded. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the.
Well, aside from also meeting the mandatory training, which our presenters will talk more about in a moment, this webinar is also applicable for OSBA's Leadership Institute program bronze level credit. The Leadership Institute program is a recognition program where we provide specific training and webinars for our members. And so this bronze level courses are foundational for board governance. You can find more information on our website at osba.org and also clicking on the board development section. Before we begin, I do want to cover just a few logistical things. Feel free to submit questions using the Q&A button. As you will see surrounding that. So please submit those throughout. And lastly, feel free to change the settings. You can enable the closed captioning by just selecting the little caret button and selecting your preference for settings. And with that, I am going to hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Janet. I'm Haley Purcell, and I'm the Chief Legal Officer and Interim Deputy Executive Director with OSBA. I will be one of your presenters tonight, along with Spencer Lewis, who is our Director of Policy Services, and Therese Holmstrom, who's one of our Senior Assistant Legal Counsels. We have a very full agenda tonight. I will be talking about the mandatory training requirement and the law surrounding that. Some definitions that are in statute and rules now that apply to public meeting law. And then I'll talk about when public meeting laws apply and when they do not apply. And then Therese will cover public meeting requirements and prohibitions. And then Spencer will talk about executive sessions and a relatively new complaint process that we have related to public meeting law violations. So starting with the mandatory training requirement that is now in place. This is a law that requires governing bodies with total expenditures of $1 million or more to have mandatory public meeting training once during each term of office. You're required to maintain a record of that training. And if requested, you are required to truthfully certify completion of that training. So there's no requirement that you submit evidence of this training to OGEC. Just as a general course, it's only if you're asked about that you have to make sure that you have a record that you can give to OGEC if they request it. Even though this is only required of governing bodies with expenditures of $1 million or more, it is recommended for all governing bodies to do this training once per term. And this term governing body is underlined because that is a term that's defined in the law, and we will talk about that here momentarily. So this is one way that you might track this training. You could take a picture of this slide. We will also make this PowerPoint available to you after the presentation. So you could just maintain the entire PowerPoint as evidence that you took the training. But if you wanted to just keep a record, just one page record, you could take a screenshot of this. The important pieces to remember that you need to keep track of is who provided the training. So in this case, it's staff of the Oregon School Boards Association, and then the date that you took the training. And we have the live date that we're doing this live. And if you're watching a video replay of this, then you would just need to put the date that you watched the video recording of this webinar. Okay, so the purpose of Oregon's public meetings law, and I'm just going to read through the statute because anytime you're kind of thinking about, is this a public meeting? Should I follow the notice requirements that Therese is going to talk about in a little while? You need to keep in mind kind of the general thought behind our Oregon government public meeting law. And that is the Oregon form of government requires an informed public aware of the deliberations and decisions of governing bodies and the information upon which such decisions were made. It is the intent of the public meeting law that decisions of governing bodies be arrived at openly. So generally, your meetings should be open, the deliberations and the way you reach decisions as a governing body should be done in public. And there are a variety of times when you can do things in executive session, which Spencer will talk about later. But for the most part, you need to make sure that you're making decisions and deliberating towards those decisions in an open meeting that's been properly noticed. And Therese will walk us through all of those requirements here in a bit. Again, there are several terms underlined here. Those are terms that are defined in law. And we will talk about those now. I'm going to start going through the definitions, and this is going to be a little bit tedious, but it is helpful to know these definitions and be able to refer back to them when you have questions about whether or not something is subject to a public meeting. What is a public meeting? Meeting means the convening of a governing body of a public body for which a quorum is required in order to make a decision or deliberate toward a decision on any matter. And so all of these terms that are underlined are defined, and we will talk through those. A simple kind of way of thinking about this is if there's a quorum and there's a discussion, deliberation, decision on public body business, then that is a meeting. What is a governing body? A governing body means the members of any public body which consists of make decisions for or recommendations to a public body on policy or administration. And then it's important to keep in mind that a governing body is different than a public body. Sometimes these definitions overlap, but not always. So a public body is the state, any regional council, county, city, or district, or any municipal or public corporation, or any board, department, commission, council, bureau, committee, or subcommittee, or advisory group, or any other agency thereof. And so a school district, an ESD, a community college, a charter school would be considered public bodies, as would the boards of those public bodies. Convening. So convening has four different definitions here. Some of them are obvious and we've known about them for years, and other ones have not been particularly specified in the statute until recently. So the first one, gathering in a physical location, that's kind of the easiest one. That's typically when you get together in person with your board. Historically, that's how school board meetings and other public body meetings happened, is everybody gathered together in a physical location. And then over time, we've started to use technology to meet. You know, you might have a board member that calls in over the phone. Everybody's in person, but one person's on the phone. And then over time, we've transitioned to sometimes a meeting has taken place completely over Zoom or some other electronic platform, and there's no one physically in one place. That is still convening. The other two are not as obvious in what they mean. Using serial electronic written communication among participants could also be a convening. And so an example of this could be a board secretary sends out an agenda to all the board members, and the board members start replying all and explaining why they will vote yes on certain action items. So that would be a convening. And most likely it would not have been properly noticed. Therese will talk about what those notice requirements are in a little bit. But this is where you could unintentionally convene as a board if you start having serial written communications among your board members. The last one here, using an intermediary to communicate among participants. So an example of this could be the board chair reaches out to each board member to get their thoughts on an upcoming vote. And with each successive conversation, the board chair shares how other board members feel and will be voting. So this is another situation where a board could find themselves accidentally having a public meeting through an intermediary, and that could cause some problems. Decision. Decision means any determination, action, vote, or final disposition upon a motion, proposal, resolution, order, ordinance, or measure on which a vote of a governing body is required at any meeting at which a quorum is present. And so at board meetings, you may make decisions and it may be called something different, but if you are making a decision by vote, then that is a decision. So it doesn't matter if you're calling it a resolution, an order, somebody makes a motion. If you are voting on something, that is making a decision. Deliberation is also defined, and that includes a discussion or communication that is part of a decision-making process. So it's important to keep in mind that part of deliberating could be one-way communications, where a communication is sent from one board member to the others, and that communication is used as part of the decision-making process. That is part of the deliberation. Communication, the expression or transmission of information from one person to another through verbal, nonverbal, written, or electronic means. Nonverbal means include gestures such as thumbs up and thumbs down, as well as sign language. So again, this is written right into the rule. It makes it clear that there are forms of communications that are nonverbal, and that would count in the definition of communication. Decision-making process is defined in the law. The process a governing body engages in to make a decision, such as identifying or selecting the nature of the decision to be made, gathering information related to a decision to be made, identifying and assessing alternatives, weighing information, and making a decision. So that's the decision-making process. Discussion means the consideration or debate of a matter. And discussion is not limited to the verbal communication, but includes the consideration of the matter. Intermediary means a person who is used to facilitate communications among members of a governing body about a matter subject to deliberation or decision by the governing body by sharing information received from a member or members of the governing body with other members of the governing body. The term intermediary can include a member of the governing body. And so in the case of a superintendent or in a school board, an intermediary may be a person like a superintendent who is facilitating a communication between different board members. Quorum is defined in the law as the minimum number of members of a governing body required to legally transact business. And there is a statute that applies to school districts and defines quorum as a majority of the members of the school district school board shall constitute a quorum. The affirmative vote of the majority of members of the board is required to transact any business. And the ESDs and community colleges have a similar statute, just a different statutory reference, and those are on the slide there. For charter schools, it may vary by charter school, so you want to look at your bylaws or charter agreement. And if you can't tell by looking at those two documents, please reach out to legal counsel, and either we or your designated legal counsel can help you figure out what a quorum is for purposes of a charter school. Serial electronic written communication. So this is also defined in the law. A series of successive or sequential communications among members of a governing body using written electronic means, including emails, texts, social media, and other electronic applications that communicate the written word. And Teresa's going to talk in a little bit more detail about that particular topic when we get to that section. So when do public meeting laws apply? So public meeting laws apply to your regular meetings. So those are your meetings that when you have your organizational meeting, usually in July, when you set your meetings for the year, those are your regular meetings. Public meeting law also applies to special meetings. So during the year, you have your regular meetings already scheduled, but sometimes there's a need to schedule a special meeting to consider something that's comes up between your regularly scheduled meetings, and you cannot wait till the regularly scheduled meeting. Emergency meetings, this one doesn't happen as often and has to include an actual emergency, something that would require the board to get together urgently. Public meeting law also applies to executive sessions, and Spencer is going to go into a lot more detail about executive sessions later. And then finally, meetings held for the purpose of either presenting information to the governing body to prepare the governing body for a regular or special meeting, or to allow the governing body to engage in preliminary discussions or deliberations. And oftentimes you are calling these work sessions or workshop meetings. Public meeting law would apply to those meetings as well. Public meeting laws apply to decision-making bodies. And a decision-making body is a body with the authority to make decisions for the public body on policy or administration. A body meets the standard if it's power to exercise governmental power and act on behalf of the public body. So definitely, for the most part, your school board is the decision-making body. It can make decisions on behalf of the public body. Public meeting laws also apply to advisory bodies. So an advisory body is a body with authority to make recommendations to a public body on policy or administration. So if you set up a committee of your board as an advisory committee and that body has the authority to make a recommendation to your full board, then public meeting law applies. And we will talk a little bit more in detail about committees and subcommittees and public meeting laws applying. But it's just important to remember that public meeting law may apply and most likely will apply to any kind of committee that your board is creating. Public meeting laws do not apply to fact gathering bodies, so bodies with only the authority to gather and provide purely factual information to a public body and that do not have the authority to make decisions or recommendations. So for example, if your board was interested in learning more about AI, for example, and you tasked 2 of your board members with going out and gathering information about different AI technologies, and they brought that back to your board for the board to consider, as long as they weren't making some sort of recommendation or decision, that would not have to be subject to the public meeting laws. Bodies advising individual public officials. So bodies appointed by an individual public official with authority to make recommendations only to that individual public official who has the authority to act on the body's recommendation and is not required to pass the recommendations on unchanged to a public body. So in the case of schools, that might be a superintendent or a director of a charter school that creates a body that's going to make recommendations to that superintendent or director, and then that superintendent or director makes a decision on their own. If that superintendent or director has to take whatever that recommendation is up to the board for a decision, then that would be a public meeting that would need to be noticed, and this exception would not apply. So this only applies if that public official that the body is reporting to has the authority to make decisions on their own without the board's input or authority. And then finally, public meeting laws do not apply to certain multi-jurisdictional bodies. And these are bodies whose Oregon members do not constitute a majority of governing bodies' voting members. I'm not exactly sure what their intent here was, but what I'm imagining is, for example, if you had less than a quorum of your board members on the OSBA board is a multi-jurisdictional body, that wouldn't be a problem. But if every single member of a particular board was on the OSBA board, then that might be something required to have a public meeting notice in your district. I'm not aware of that happening, but that's one example I could think of. Also not a meeting. On-site inspections of any project or program. So if your entire school board wants to go see a new CTE program that just started in the district, you can do that, and that's not a meeting that you have to notice. Your whole board can go to a national, regional, or state association meeting, and that is not a meeting that you have to notice. Social gatherings, as a board, you can meet as a full board for a social gathering. And this case here involved a school board that had a barbecue, and somebody was concerned about whether that was a public meeting, and the Court of Appeal said no, school boards can have social gatherings. Now, the caveat with all 3 of these things is if you go and see a program, or you attend a conference, or you have a social gathering, you can do that, but it would become a public meeting if you start trying to decide or deliberate any decision while you're at that particular event or program. So the key would be to avoid deliberating or making decisions about anything regarding the district or the charter school or community college or ESD while you're at one of those events. These are newer things to add it to the law, not a meeting. So purely factual or educational in nature, and that convey no deliberation or decision on any matter that might reasonably come before the governing body. That would not be a meeting. Not related to any matter that at any time could reasonably be foreseen to come before the governing body for deliberation or decision. So like if a quorum of your board or a whole board was emailing each other, texting each other, just had a conversation at a social gathering about, who you want to be elected mayor of the city. That would not be a public meeting because the board's never going to be voting on the mayor of the city together. That's just not business that ever comes before the school board. So it's just not related and doesn't have to be noticed as a public meeting. And then finally, non-substantive in nature, such as communications relating to scheduling, leaves of absence, and other similar matters. So frequently when you're scheduling your board meetings or special meetings, you might communicate via email or text, hey, are you available Tuesday night at 5? And people start responding yes or no, or I'm not available till 5:30, and those kinds of communications, that would not be a public meeting because it's non-substantive in nature and you're just talking about scheduling. So that's something that we've known for a while, but now this is in the law. So it's really nice that we have clarity in the law around that. And I've touched on this a couple of times now, but whether or not public meeting law applies to committees, subcommittees, advisory committees, is if that committee, subcommittee, advisory committee has the authority to make a decision for a public body. So if the board has authorized that committee, subcommittee to make a decision for the public body, or if that group has the authority to make recommendations to the public body, then those are public meetings and they need to be noticed. And again, one of these committees or subcommittees could be 2 or more board members. Okay, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Therese.
Thank you, Haley. So we've discussed what a meeting is and when public meetings law applies. So now we're going to discuss the required elements. And I may use the term district out of habit, but as Haley mentioned earlier, all of these rules and laws apply equally to community colleges, charter schools, and ESDs as well. Where they are different, I'll point that out. All right, so first and foremost, public meetings must be open to the public, except as otherwise permitted under the law, which is under executive session, and we'll talk about that in more detail. The law prohibits a quorum of the governing body from meeting in private for the purpose of deciding on or deliberating towards a decision on any matter. And so all of these requirements that we're going to go over are what you need to establish to make sure that the meeting is not held in private. So public meetings must comply with certain location requirements. The location of public meetings generally must be within the geographic boundaries of the public body. For school boards, this is generally going to be the district boundaries. The meetings could also be held at an administrative headquarters if that was outside of the geographic boundaries, or at the nearest practical location. Or the law does allow for holding a public meetings in Indian country, Oregon. I've not seen that come up. And the location must be accessible to persons with disabilities, which I'll talk about in a minute. I want to mention, when we're talking about location, 2 things. One, for some virtual charter schools, there may be sometimes a question about where that meeting should be held. And I would say generally that's a case where the public body's administrative headquarters is probably the best in terms of a physical location. And then we also get questions about the location of a board retreat and whether or not the board can have a retreat outside of the boundaries of the district, for example. If that retreat meets the criteria to be a public meeting that we just went through, then then the location of the retreat should be held within the boundaries of, or should meet these criteria that I just mentioned. And it should not be somewhere far afield, because it needs to be open to the public, and that means the public of the district. All right. So there are a few exceptions, however, for the location of a public meeting. If there's a training session where there's no deliberations toward a decision, right, then it's not going to necessarily meet the definition of a public meeting that we went over. And that's not one that has to meet those location requirements. a joint meeting of governing bodies or of a governing body and Oregon Indian tribal officials is another situation where it could be held in a different location. And then finally, if there's an actual emergency that necessitates immediate action, then that's a situation where you don't necessarily have to meet those specific location requirements. There's also under Oregon law, meetings of public meetings may not be held in a location that discriminates on the basis of several protected classes, such as race, color, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, age, or disability. This kind of furthers the idea that anyone can attend public meetings. I've not seen this come up, but I imagine that we may see questions about this in the coming years, especially for some of our charter school boards that sometimes meet in buildings that are owned and operated by other community organizations. And in addition to holding the meeting in a location where discrimination is not practiced, the meeting must also be in a place that is accessible to persons with disabilities. And the board must also provide an interpreter for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing if they're requested at least 48 hours in advance. There's no, I want to point out kind of while we're talking about the interpreter language, there's no requirement under public meetings law to translate a public meeting into different languages. This is something that your district should just consider based on the needs of your district and then provide any communication supports that might be appropriate. All right. It is required under Oregon Public Meetings Law to make all meetings accessible remotely through technological means to the extent reasonably possible, and provide opportunities for members of the general public to remotely submit oral and written testimony if in-person oral and written testimony is also allowed. And we'll talk a little bit about virtual meetings, a little bit more about virtual meetings in the next slides. Meetings may be held entirely virtually, where board members attend remotely and there's no physical location for members of the public to attend. One thing I want to point out, then if a member of the public body is allowed to attend remotely, the Oregon rules do say that members of the media must be allowed to attend remotely as well. This is a new rule. For a virtual meeting, there's no requirement, if you have a virtual meeting, there's no requirement that you make a physical location available. It's sufficient to provide electronic means to at least listen to the meeting, or, you know, as I mentioned, to the extent reasonably possible, provide a full remote participation option. And so there's no requirement that you necessarily have somewhere at the district, for example, where people can attend, even if everyone else is participating virtually. All right, so we've discussed who may attend the public meeting and where it must be held. So now I want to talk about all of the requirements of providing notice about a public meeting. The rules require that a notice for meetings which are open to all members of the public contain at least the following information: the time, date, and location, the electronic link or telephone access information, a list of the principal subjects anticipated to be considered at the meeting, and generally that's accomplished by providing the agenda to the public. But that does not mean that you cannot add subjects to be considered at the meeting once you are in your public meeting. Boards do have the right to add subjects to the agenda. And then finally, notice of a public meeting must also include the name, telephone number, and email address of a person to contact if someone needs to request an interpreter or other communication aids, or if you're planning on providing a sign language interpreter or other communication aid, that'll be provided, right? And that's to comply with that law that you must make provide some accommodations to those who are deaf or hard of hearing. Right. So to provide notice to the public, the method which is sufficient and easiest to meet is to post notice of the meetings conspicuously on your website. Such as an agenda. If you do not have a website, then there are other options, such as there's the Oregon Transparency website, and then there's kind of a whole list in the rule that we have on our slide here of other means that will provide notice to the public. We do encourage districts to go ahead and review your practices to ensure notice is adequate because of some of these recent changes, like such as, including information about who to contact for an interpreter for those who might need it that are deaf or hard of hearing. Notice is generally accomplished by district staff, but these requirements are applicable to the boards. All right, so in addition to the requirement to provide notice to the general public, there is also a requirement to provide actual notice to interested persons, those who are known to the district that are interested in receiving notice of a public meeting. And the rule says that this can be done using mailing lists, listserv, social media, or any other means reasonably calculated to provide actual notice. We would, maintaining a list is a safe and easy way to meet this requirement. But if you have any concerns or questions about it, we recommend that you reach out to us or your general counsel to make sure that you're meeting this requirement. Just like with the notice to the interested persons, you also have an obligation to provide actual notice to members of the media who have requested it. And you can satisfy that in this either by providing them the notice in the method that the media representative requests, if they request a specific method, or you have the discretion to provide that notice by any other means reasonably calculated to provide that. So you're not required to provide notice to media representatives in the way that they ask. All right, so there is a special requirement for notice of public meetings for ESDs. ESDs are required to provide notices of their public meetings on the Oregon Transparency website to the extent practicable. And this is a requirement that is also for on state agencies. All right. So what about notice of meetings not open to the public? The notice, if there's a meeting that's not going to be open to the public, the notice has to include additional information. You must include the specific statutory citation and appropriate subsection and paragraph, which authorizes you to enter into a portion of the meeting that is closed to the public, and a general description of what that statutory authorization is. For example, you could add onto your agenda citation to ORS 192-662A to consider the employment of a public officer, employee, staff member, or agent, right? That's an example of something that you could add that would satisfy, that requirement to provide that extra notice. And then if the executive session is part of an open meeting, which is the most common, right? A board has an open meeting and then switches into executive session. The presiding officer must identify in the open session that same statutory provision and a general description of what it is as the reason for going into a session that is closed to the public. And Spencer's going to talk more about what executive session means and who's allowed and all that stuff. All right, so when do you have to provide notice of a public meeting? For a regular meeting, you should provide as much notice as reasonably possible, but no less than 48 hours advance notice. For a special meeting, you must provide notice at least 24 hours in advance. And then there is an option to have an emergency meeting where you meet with less than 24 hours notice to the public. And you only provide notice as is appropriate to the circumstances. There's an obligation to attempt to contact media and other interested persons if going into that to an emergency meeting. And then if you rely on the emergency meeting statute to kind of to go into a meeting with less than 24 hours notice, you should, in your minutes, describe what the emergency was that justified having your meeting with less than 24 hours notice and why it could not be delayed for 24 hours. All right. So we've discussed who can attend, where the public meeting must be held, what sort of notice must be provided, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about your record keeping obligation. You are required to keep minutes of your public meetings, and they must include a true reflection of the matters discussed and the views of the participants, as well as all members of the governing body present, all motions, proposals, resolutions, orders, ordinances, and measures that are proposed and how and what their disposition was, the results of all votes, and the vote of each member by name if your board has 25 or fewer members, the substance of any discussion on any matter, and a reference to any document that's discussed at the meeting. All of these are the required elements for your minutes. And we often get the question about when do minutes need to be available. There's no specific requirement in public meetings law as to when the meetings need to be available, but the law does say they need to be available within a reasonable time after the meeting. And so, you know, the law does recognize that it takes some time to create the minutes. These minutes are public records and need to be retained permanently under Oregon's rules about retention of public records. Because they are public records, they must be disclosed upon request. There are some exceptions for executive session minutes, however, which are generally going to be confidential. And so we're going to discuss executive session meeting minutes next. So even when you have a meeting not open to the public, there's still a requirement to create and retain minutes. And the content requirements are the same, with the exception of some, you know, involving students, and Spencer's going to go into that more. You're not required, if someone requests your executive session meeting minutes, you're not required to disclose them if the disclosure is inconsistent with the purpose for which the meeting was authorized to be held. So there's no guarantee that you'll never have to disclose your executive session minutes, but it's generally not going to be the case. Of course, if you have someone who's requested a copy of your executive session meeting minutes, then I would request that you go ahead and speak with your general counsel or case legal so that we can kind of help you work through that request. All right, so we also get questions about keeping recordings of meetings instead of written minutes. The Oregon Public Meetings Law does allow for maintaining a recording of a meeting as minutes if the recording has all the required pieces of the minutes. But the Oregon Secretary of State requires that school board meeting minutes be kept in hard copy. So there is a process to get a waiver from the Secretary of State's Archives Division if you want to keep your recordings as your minutes. I would recommend that if you're considering that process, that you work with the Archives Division. And, you know, we have also gotten the question about whether or not a transcript of a recording, if it's approved by the board as minutes, would count. And it probably, if it has all the content requirements and if you're maintaining it in hard copy, then it probably meets both of those requirements. All right. Speaking of recordings, this year a new law went into effect that requires school districts, ESDs, community college districts, and public universities to post video recordings of non-executive session meetings within 7 days of the meeting. These recordings need to be posted to your website or to a social media site. If the district facilities lack broadband internet access, then an audio recording is sufficient to comply with this law. And this does not apply to smaller school districts that have fewer than 50 ADMs. And also, of course, the requirement to post a recording of the the meeting does not apply to executive session. All right, so now we're going to talk about the role of members of the public at a public meeting and the role to participate. Public meetings law does not have any requirements of a right to participate or a right to provide public testimony or public comment. It's just a right to know what's going on. However, there are a few times where boards must allow public comment, such as, budget approvals, charter approvals, prior to using certain requirements for executive session. And then, of course, many boards allow for public comment because it can be a useful tool. So if you do allow for public comment, then there are a few requirements that you need to follow under Oregon's public meetings law. When public testimony is permitted, then you do need to allow for oral testimony by telephone, video, other electronic or virtual means if you're allowing for in-person oral testimony. And similarly, the same for written testimony, including electronic, if you're allowing for in-person written testimony, but you can require that it be submitted in advance. So you just have to have parity between the two. And then also, when you're allowing for public comment, the presiding officer of the board has authority under Oregon public meeting law to keep order and impose reasonable restrictions to make sure that the meeting is conducted efficiently and orderly. So this generally means, and so this means you can regulate the order of public comment, the length of how long you will allow someone to speak in public comment, and also limit appearances to people who are only going to comment on subjects that are on the agenda, for example. But I do want to point out that boards should be careful to avoid viewpoint discrimination, which could result in a complaint of a First Amendment violation, and to work with their general counsel or contact Pace Legal if there's a question about that. There has been litigation on this issue. So if you're dealing with issues surrounding public comment and when and how to restrict public comment on certain subjects, this is something that, just be mindful that there are some potential legal ramifications of that. All right, so public meetings law also has requirements for voting. Any action by the board must be taken during a board meeting. This is typically done by votes of the board. Votes must be public, and the vote of each member and the result of the vote must be included in the minutes. The board is not allowed to use secret ballots. Written ballots are allowed, but in order for them to not be secret ballots, the written ballot must include the name and the vote and then be announced during the meeting. These are all the requirements of the new rules. All right, so Haley discussed serial communications among what serial communications are and the new rule, which kind of defines serial communications. Serial communications among a quorum of board members can be considered a meeting of the board, and this is prohibited by public meetings law because those meetings, if it's a series of communications among a quorum of the board where there's discussions happening about that are kind of leading towards a decision, even if no decision is made in the serial communications, if they are discussions leading towards a decision, that is considered a meeting, but it is not a meeting that meets all of those public meetings law requirements that we just discussed because it's not open to the public. It's not at what, it doesn't meet the location requirements. There's no notice, all of that. So the new Oregon rules on public meetings law specifies that a series of communications, whether directly or through intermediaries, cannot be used for the purpose of deliberating on any matter that is within the jurisdiction of the governing body. And the rules go on to list the methods of serial communications that could result in a serial meeting. So this includes in-person communications, telephone calls, videos, video conferencing, written communications, such as emails, text messages, other messaging applications, use of one or more intermediaries to convey information among members, any other means of conveying information. And the intermediary does not have to be a member of the board. As Haley walked through that definition, the intermediary could be someone who is not a member of the board if that person is being used to convey information among the members of the board. If there are specific scenarios that you're concerned about with regard to this, I suggest that you contact legal counsel and make sure that your practices are consistent with the public meetings law requirements. And with that, I think I'm ready to hand it over to Spencer. Thank you.
Awesome. There's a couple of really good questions in the chat waiting for you, Therese. So have fun with those. A couple of the questions, and if we're unable to answer your questions live here, don't hesitate to reach out to us individually by email. A lot of them do depend on the specific facts and how a committee might be set up and what their role might be. And whether or not one of the exceptions in public meeting law may or may not apply. So we will answer questions as we get to the end as well. But thank you for all those questions. And we're flying. We're going through faster than I thought. So I can spend all sorts of time. We're going to talk about executive sessions though, really quickly. And you're probably very familiar with executive sessions and what they are. And what the law says is that you are allowed to hold an executive session during a regular, special, or emergency meeting. But in order to do so, there's a couple of things that you need to make sure that you do. The first is you want to make sure that you identify what law authorizes you to use executive session. And we're going to go through a number of these today. Many of you have them in your board policies, list out the primary pieces, the primary reasons that you could go into executive session. Most of them are listed in ORS 192-660 section 2, though there's a few more in ORS 332. So, but we're going to talk through those, but that is important that before going into executive session, you need to make sure that you're stating why and why you're going into executive session and what law gives you the authority to go into executive session to discuss that. The law only allows you to go in for certain reasons. And like I said, you must identify what you're going in for. As board members, it's very important that you understand what you're going into executive session for. If you have questions as to whether or not this is an appropriate reason, then please reach out to legal counsel, reach out to the Ethics Commission, because that's on you as individuals if you attend an executive session that is not an appropriate reason to go into executive session. The actual definition for executive session might be a little bit different than what you might think, but the actual definition is any meeting or part of a meeting which is closed to certain persons for deliberations on certain matters. So if you exclude people from a meeting, then that's going to be considered an executive session potentially. So you want to just keep that in mind. Generally, it's the board in attendance, though it's very common to have additional individuals, such as the superintendent or your administrator. You could have legal counsel present. You could have other staff members present. You could have students present. You could have their representatives present. So there's a lot of other individuals that may be added to an executive session. But remember, it's the board's meeting, and the board can have whoever it feels is necessary to be in attendance at that executive session. As we mentioned earlier, executive sessions can be part of regular, special, or emergency meetings. So they can just be an agenda item on any one of those meetings. They can be held separate. So you can have an executive session, on a Tuesday at 9 a.m. that does not have any open portion to it. There's no open meeting part to it. And you can hold an executive session for that reason. It's important to keep in mind that executive sessions are still public meetings. They're not held in public. They're not accessible to the public, but the other public meeting requirements are still going to apply. And that includes notice, minutes, location, accessibility, those types of things. You might ask, well, why is that? Well, you may have members of you may have a student or a family member, you may have a member of the media that has or that's going to be attending, and you need to make sure that your meeting is physically accessible to those who might be attending. A few things that are unique to executive session. First, you are generally not allowed to make any final action or make any final decision, really take any votes in executive session. You can come to general informal consensus. You say, yeah, I think we know where we're going coming out of this executive session, but you're generally not allowed to vote. There are some exceptions around some student-related issues out of ORS 332, but for the most part, you cannot vote in executive session. Like I mentioned, the news media is allowed to attend executive session generally. There's a few exceptions. Labor negotiations is one of those exceptions. Student issues, and then current litigation or litigation that's likely to be filed if the news media is a party to the litigation. So those are the reasons why news media may be excluded. News media should be instructed not to report. So as you're going into executive session, many boards have a script that they read that says you are specifically instructed not to report on what is discussed in the executive session. And then again, the board and any of the board's guests that they are choosing to invite into the executive session would be allowed to attend. One of the questions that often comes up is who is considered news media? Now, I think it's important to think about most of the public meeting laws were written in the 1970s and were largely unchanged until this last group of public meeting laws were changed. Now, if we think about who a person or what the news media looked like in the 1970s compared to what it might look like now, things might be very different. There is an Attorney General opinion from 2016 that talks about who would be considered a representative of the news media, especially looking into the blogging or internet media, different pieces, different ways that information is shared, and who would be considered there. So if you have questions about whether a particular entity within your district or within your area might be a member of the news media, or if someone is claiming to be a member of news media, this would be a great place to start. Also recommend that you work with legal counsel in making a determination there as to whether or not those people might be allowed to attend your executive sessions. The next piece is around executive sessions with virtual attendees. We discussed earlier that open meetings must be available virtually, but this is not the case for executive sessions. You are allowed to have an executive session that is not made available virtually. However, and as Therese mentioned earlier, if any member of the governing body or if anybody's attending that executive session virtually, then members of the news media need to be allowed to attend virtually as well. So just keep that in mind if you're holding an executive session that is only going to be in person, but then if one of the board members needs to attend virtually because, they're sick or they can't make it or for some other reason, that same opportunity needs to be extended to members of the news media to attend virtually as well. Announcing executive session is important, and it's a little bit different depending on how the executive session is coming into being. But you need to make a public announcement of that statutory authorization. Your authority to do the executive session has to be made prior to that executive session. And if only an executive session is being held, so this is a meeting that does an executive session that doesn't have an open meeting component to it before it or after it or anything like that, then the notice that you're going to be holding an executive session needs to include that statutory authorization. So you could say the board is holding an executive session on, Tuesday, February 17th at 9 a.m. The purpose of the board will meet an executive session under ORS and then use the statutory provision and explain, very briefly the reason why you're using executive session. And I generally recommend that boards just use the language directly from statute that follows the authorization piece. And that's if you're holding an executive session that is just an executive session. If you're holding an executive session that is part of an open meeting, so it's just an agenda item of a meeting that's being held open for the public, the announcement needs to be made during the portion of the meeting open to the public. So in this situation, it may just be one of your regular board meetings, and agenda item 4 happens to be an executive session. So when you get to agenda item 4, the presiding officer is simply going to say, we're now going to meet in executive session, cite the statutory provision, and then and share the, you know, the little blurb from statute, and then the board can go into executive session. These are also going to be in the, you know, in the written minute or written notice, and then included in the minutes as well. This is a sample script from the Oregon Attorney General's Public Meetings Manual. Many of you probably use this or use something similar that simply states we're going into executive session for these reasons. Media are allowed to attend, others are asked to leave. Representatives of the media are specifically directed not to report on, you know, information here. But it can be a great resource and can be helpful for you if you're trying to figure out, well, what do I need to say? Excuse me. Here's something that you can say and just have ready for you. We're going to go through several of the common reasons for executive session. Now, these aren't all of them. There's more. These are the ones that we typically see in the school district, ESD, charter school, and community college realm. If you also serve on another type of board, then you might think, oh, well, he skipped this one. Well, that's probably because it doesn't really apply to too much to school boards or in the education realm. And you'll notice some asterisks listed as well. We'll all talk about some of the prerequisites or the unique characteristics around those particular executive sessions. The first is to consider the employment of a public officer. As board members, this is probably only going to show up when you're hiring a superintendent, an executive director, a president. That's typically where this would come up. The asterisk is there because there are prerequisites for this. You can't just say, hey, we're going to meet tonight in executive session to hire a new superintendent. There are things you've got to notice it. There's other pieces that you're required to do before you can go into executive session on this. The second one here is perhaps the most common, or the one we hear about the most, to consider the dismissal or disciplining of, or to hear complaints brought against a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent. So if a complaint is filed against a staff member, this would be the provision that likely would get you into executive session. There are some asterisks listed here. Part of this includes that you have to notify that individual ahead of time and give them the option for an open or an executive session. So it's the person that the complaint is about that would have the decision there. The third bullet here is around to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations. So again, one of the unique labor pieces, the board can meet with its labor negotiators to discuss strategy and to discuss the process, and that can be done in executive session. 2E is the next one here around real property transactions. The next one is 2F, and that's to consider information or records that are exempt by law from public inspection. In the school setting, this is probably most common to see student records that are protected by FERPA. So if the board needs for some reason to review student records, that could be done in executive session. Also, personnel records are generally going to be protected from disclosure. Also, attorney-client privileged information. So if you have something from legal counsel that is protected by attorney-client privilege, the board could go into executive session to review those records. The next one here is 2H, to consult with counsel, to consult with legal counsel concerning the legal rights or duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation likely to be filed. And for this provision, there's like two key pieces. One is counsel has to be present. So your legal counsel needs to be present either in person or virtually. You know, they could be on the phone or available via Zoom. That would be permissible. But it also has to be with regard to current litigation or litigation that's likely to be filed. It can't just be, just some random topic that the board would like to discuss. The next one is 2I. Excuse me. And that's to review the employment-related performance of the chief executive officer or another employee. And as a board, you are generally only going to be evaluating the superintendent or the president or the executive director, the highest official within the body. So, and again, there's some asterisks here. The person being evaluated, they get the opportunity to to choose whether that's going to be an open or executive session. So you need to make sure that you let them know ahead of time that at least 24 hours or 1 business day, whichever is longer, you need to let them know ahead of time and give them the option of open or executive session. Most of the time, they're going to choose executive session, though we have seen situations where they choose to do that in open session. There's also on here is 2K, which is just another provision for executive session. It's to consider matters related to school safety. So anything related to school safety or safety threats, you're allowed to use executive session if discussing that in open session would potentially be problematic and you feel that it would be better to be in executive session. Few more, don't worry. I know there's a lot of them. The next one is 2.0, and this is a very new provision in the last couple of years, to consider matters relating to the safety of the governing body and of public body staff and volunteers. So if the board needs to discuss its own safety or the safety of staff or volunteers and the facilities and those kinds of things, you can use executive session for that. Another new one for cybersecurity infrastructure and responses to cybersecurity threats. So important to understand that if there's a cybersecurity issue that you want to discuss in executive session, you certainly can. It's important to note on a couple of, the last few around safety, cybersecurity, those kinds of things. There may be situations where you determine that it's best to have some of those conversations in open session. And that's perfectly allowable. But if there's pieces that you feel are going to be better discussed in executive session to keep some of that information confidential, then you can go ahead and you can still use executive session for those. And the final two here are really unique for K-12. So around the expulsion of a minor student and really around any matters pertaining to a minor's confidential education records or to a student's education records. So additional reasons that you can go into executive session. Those are the primary ones. Obviously, something else could apply, and these are generally listed in most of your policies. Just a few, and I tried to touch on these as we went through, but just to highlight them again. 2A, which was to consider the employment of a public officer, employee, staff member, or agent. And I mentioned, well, there are some prerequisites. Well, this is just a list of some of those prerequisites that need to take place prior to going into executive session for that. There are often times where we will get a phone call and a board member says, hey, we just found out that our superintendent is resigning or leaving or retiring, leaving the district for whatever reason. Can we go into executive session tonight and discuss our plan moving forward? And the answer is probably no, because in order to use 2A, which is the provision that you would generally use, you've got a list of prerequisites that include advertising the vacancy, adopting hiring procedures, and those types of things. So it's important to keep that in mind anytime you're looking to use provision 2A. I mentioned 2B and 2I around a complaint against a staff member or the evaluation, the employment evaluation of, your CEO, your superintendent, president, executive director, those types of things. You have to give them notice ahead of time before you can use executive session for that, because they get the opportunity to choose. And so that notice to them has to be 1 business day or 24 hours ahead of time. It has to include the name of the governing body, which hopefully they're going to know anyways, the time, date, and location of the meeting, the purpose of the executive session, and then how they could request an open hearing if that's what they would prefer. So it doesn't have to have a lot of information. And typically, if there's a complaint involved, then you may be working with legal counsel, and they can assist you in figuring out what information to share in those situations. Next one, and this is just around all of these that discuss, hiring, that talk about complaints, that talk about evaluation. These conversations in executive session should not include conversations around compensation, salaries, and benefits. Those are not executive session provisions, especially specifically 2A, 2B, and 2I do not authorize you to talk about compensation, salaries, and benefits in the executive session. So if you're going in under 2A, that should really be about identifying the individual that you want to hire into that position, and the conversation about the compensation would not happen. Same thing around an evaluation of your CEO. That executive session is around evaluating that individual, not determining how much of a raise they should or should not get. One piece that we often get questions around is complaints against board members and whether or not executive session can be used in those situations. OGEC has determined that ORS 192-662B, which is the complaints against a public officer, employee, staff member, or individual agent, does not always apply to complaints against board members. The key factor is whether the governing body's charter or enabling legislation allows the governing body to discipline or dismiss their fellow board members. And with school districts, typically, you are not able to really discipline or dismiss a fellow board member. So this would not be the case for school district boards, ESD boards, and community college boards. For charter schools, that may be a little bit different because you have different language in your bylaws around dismissal or removal of fellow board members. So if that comes up and you have questions, we encourage you to work with legal counsel. There may be a provision other than 2B that applies, and we can help work through some of those questions and some of those challenges that may exist there. Mentioned earlier, labor negotiations and executive sessions. And you can hold executive sessions to discuss deliberations with those that have been designated to represent you. So that's one type of an executive session. The other piece, though, is that labor negotiations shall be conducted in open meetings unless the negotiators for both sides request that the negotiations be conducted in executive session. So the default is that negotiations are going to be an open session. However, if both sides request that the actual negotiations take place in executive session, that can be done. If they're being held in executive session, then the notice requirements are gone. Then those executive sessions are not subject to the notice requirements in ORS 192-640. So it's kind of a weird situation. We encourage you to work with legal counsel, your labor counsel around that if there are questions there. But it is just an important distinction to mention and make sure you are aware of. With all of these executive sessions and with public meeting law questions, OGEC is authorized to provide information and to provide guidance, issue an advisory opinion, and provide written or oral staff advice for such situations, especially regarding executive sessions. And the Ethics Commission is actually really wonderful to work with, they're wonderful to work with if you reach out to them ahead of time. If it's after the fact, they may end up they may open up an investigation or something like that. But if you reach out to them ahead of the time, they're wonderful to work with. They'll provide you with information. They'll give you the information that you need to keep you out of trouble. And they will provide information on all types of public meeting law. This is relatively new to them. Just in the last several years, they've been given more and more authority over. It started with executive session, and now it's expanded to all public meeting laws. But they are great to work with, and they can provide information for you and be really helpful in that regard. OGC also has the authority to issue civil penalties of up to $1,000 for each board member for violations of public meeting laws. Now, this is typically, this isn't the way they typically work. They're not looking to issue civil penalties or anything like that. That would really likely only be in a situation where board members intentionally disregarded the law and chose to violate public meeting law. Most of the time, and I say most of the time, there haven't been a lot of complaints that have been appealed up to the Ethics Commission about school board members or about public meetings in general. But most of the time, they will issue a letter of instruction and say, hey, it looks like you probably violated public meeting law here. We encourage you to participate in training, make sure you meet your mandatory training requirement, here's some more additional guidance if you need it. And please don't mess up again. That's typically what their response is going to be, though they do have the authority to issue a civil penalty. One piece on the civil penalty, if you're acting under the advice of legal counsel, then the letter of education is going to be the response typically, that they can't issue a civil penalty. So if you have a situation coming up, especially around an executive session, and you have concerns as to whether or not this is an appropriate reason to go into executive session, you can reach out to legal counsel. You can also reach out to OGC and ask them. But if you reach out to legal counsel and legal counsel says, yes, this is an appropriate reason to go into executive session, even if a complaint is filed later on, even if the Ethics Commission determines that, hey, legal counsel was wrong and you should not have used executive session in that situation, you would be protected from any civil penalty from the Ethics Commission. There's also the possibility for a lawsuit to be filed against the district. We don't see these very often, and especially with the Ethics Commission option that we're going to talk about in a little bit, we don't anticipate seeing a lot of those, but they certainly are possible. And it's important to note that insurance policies generally don't provide coverage for individuals who intentionally violate the law. So make sure that you are staying informed and making good decisions about what public meeting choices you're making. Probably the biggest change to public meeting law in the last few years and out of this bunch of legislation was around grievances and complaints. It used to be really that in order to file any type of a complaint, you probably had to go to the court system. And filing something through the court system is expensive and takes a lot of time. And so for that reason, we really haven't seen a lot of lawsuits around public meeting law. However, there's a change. And now complaints can be filed directly with the governing body. And then after going through the governing body has a certain amount of time in order to respond. And then the individual who filed the complaint can appeal that up to the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. Now, I already messed up. I used the wrong terminology, so I'm going to correct myself. Something that is filed with the governing body, so with the district, with the ESD, the charter school, the community college, that's going to be called a grievance. Now, we don't like to see that word grievance, right? Because in the education world, when we see grievance, we think collective bargaining agreement. Well, now we've got two potential reasons why we might hear the word grievance. But if you get a grievance around public meeting law, you're going to follow some procedures that we're going to work through in just a second. After that grievance has been handled by the district or the ESD or charter school or community college, or is ignored or the timelines are not met, the person who filed that grievance can then file what's called a complaint with the Ethics Commission. So the complaint is kind of like the appeal up to the Ethics Commission, and the grievance is like the initial complaint. But that's the language that I'm going to try to use. But like I said, I already messed up once, so we'll see. And any individual who believes that your board has violated public meeting law, they can file a complaint, or messed up. They can file a grievance. So they can file a grievance directly with you as a public body, or they can go the lawsuit route. But again, expensive, time consuming. They're probably going to start with this grievance process. As a public body, you're required to accept or receive those grievances. And the public body, you must accept grievances filed in person during your regular business hours, through first class mail, or through email. Excuse me. And you can accept grievances filed in other ways, but those are 3 ways that you're required to accept grievances that might be filed. Jump 2 slides real quick, and then 1 more. Oh, sorry, back 1. I guess there's a delay. Sorry. On your website, you are required to include information about how and who those grievances can be submitted to. And so the person and contact information, and then the hours in which those grievances will be accepted. If you don't put this on your website, then the grievance can be filed with the chief administrative officer or to the chair of the public body. And I think we'd probably all recommend that if the chief administrative officer or the chair of your public body receives one of these grievances, you consider it submitted and you process it accordingly. If you don't have a website, you can publish this notice in the same manner as your other public meeting notices. But basically you need to, if something is submitted, you need to make sure that you're receiving it and then you're going to process it accordingly. So once the public body receives it, you have, well, a couple of pieces for that. Sorry about that. The grievance must be in writing. So you can require that it must be in writing. Now, an email is in writing. An electronic submission is considered to be in writing. So it doesn't have to be like on paper delivered or submitted to you. It must be written. It must be filed within 30 days of the alleged violation. So they can't go back to 2016 and say, hey, I think you violated public meeting law on this day. It's got to be timely within 30 days of the alleged violation. And then it must be filed directly with the public body. The grievance must include the name of the governing body, the date of the violation, the specific facts and circumstances, the date of the grievance, so the date that they're submitting it to you as a public body, and the name and contact information of the person filing the grievance. It doesn't have to have a ton of information. Hopefully there's enough in the specific facts and circumstances so that you as a public body understand what the claim is and what they believe that you have violated there. But that's what the grievance might look like. Once you receive that as a public body, you have 21 days to respond. And there's really only 3 different responses for you. One, you can deny the facts. Say, no, that did not happen. You may be able to provide additional information. Perhaps you have a video recording of what happened or whatever, but you might be able to say, no, those facts did not happen. So there's no violation. That's the first option. The second option is you can say, yes, those things happened, but it was not a violation of public meeting law because of blank. And that may be, you may include some exceptions that are included in statute. It may be some different pieces that we've talked about today. But your response may say, yes, we did those things, or those things happened, but it was not a violation because the laws say this. And then the third option is to just admit and admit. Say, yes, those things happened. Yes, we acknowledge that was a violation of public meeting law. And so as a public body, whatever your response is, you have to provide a written response to the person that filed the grievance and have to file a copy of that with the Oregon Government Ethics Commission. So within 21 days, that's a very short timeline, especially where many of you meet monthly to receive one. Let's say it came in 3 days after your meeting. You may have to schedule a special meeting in order to get this processed before that 21-day deadline. The law doesn't say anything about business days or anything, so I would treat this as 21 calendar days from the receipt of the grievance. Oh, and these next few slides, I probably kind of already covered them. And due to time, we'll probably, well, I guess with this admit, this is just the third one of those options. You can rescind the decision, or you can acknowledge in a public meeting that it was a violation, that you can't really rescind it, and what you're going to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So let's say that a meeting wasn't noticed and you didn't realize it, but for whatever reason, the notice wasn't published as everyone thought that it was. So the complaint could come in, you could say, hey, we now know that we violated public meeting law because the notice wasn't provided. If it's a decision that's easy to rescind, you could go ahead and do that. But if it's something that you can't really undo, then you would say, hey, we approved a contract that has been entered into at this point, and we can't walk out of the contract right now. So we acknowledge the violation. We can't really rescind it because of these reasons. And this is what we're going to do to make sure that it does not happen again. So that can be important and helpful. This is just a visual of the timeline. Again, a person filing a grievance has 30 days to file that written grievance with the board. Once received by the board has 21 days to provide a written response, both to the grievance and a copy going to the Ethics Commission. And then after that, if the person filing the grievance wants to, they can file a complaint directly with the Ethics Commission, who would then open it up and start to look at it. If someone wants to file a complaint, so they filed the grievance with the district or with the public body, and it has been, completed or has gone past 21 days, then the individual can file the complaint with the Ethics Commission. They're required to provide documentation of their actions. So they're required to show how they have filed the initial grievance with the public body, and they're required to provide the public body's response as well. So if someone goes directly to the Ethics Commission, excuse me, with a complaint that you have violated public meeting law, the Ethics Commission is going to say, well, did you file a grievance with the public body? And if they say no, or they don't have evidence that they've filed a grievance, then the Ethics Commission is going to send them back to file a grievance with the public body. If the 30-day window has lapsed, then they're probably going to be out of luck as far as filing the grievance. Now, if they file the complaint with the Ethics Commission and say, hey, yes, we did file with the public body, but the public body never responded to us, or it's taken longer than 21 days, then the Ethics Commission is likely going to step in and start looking into that there. When a complaint is filed against the public body, it's going to go against all members of the public body. So a complainant generally doesn't get to pick and choose which governing members will be investigated. Each governing body member will have the opportunity to respond, though. So if someone might file a grievance or a complaint identifying only a single board member, well, each board member is going to be included in that complaint. Now, if you weren't present or if it doesn't apply to you for some reason, you're going to include that in your own individual response. But it is going to go against everybody. And if it goes to the Ethics Commission, there's going to be what's called consolidation. And during the preliminary stages, those complaints against all of the board members on your board, they're going to be consolidated through the preliminary hearing and the investigation stages, just for simplicity's purposes. It's going to be investigated, and so the OGEC can work through that in a more timely manner than investigating an individual complaint against each individual board member. But individual determinations, final decisions will be made for each board member. Dismissal, a complaint that is dismissed because the complainant failed to comply with the requirements is a procedural dismissal only, meaning that OGEC could take the complaint up on their own, or a new complaint could be filed that does meet the procedural requirements. So just because something makes its way to OGEC and they have to dismiss it, it doesn't mean that that same cause of action couldn't come up before OGEC in another way. A few more things really quickly regarding complaints. If the public body fails to respond within 21 days, or the complainant is not satisfied with the public body's response, they can file the complaint with OGEC. OGEC does have the authority to investigate those complaints, and OGEC can impose the civil penalty of up to $1,000 to members of the governing body. And that would be the personal responsibility of those individual board members, not the responsibility of the public body as a whole. While OGEC does have a role in when complaints are filed, OGEC does also have the authority to open up an investigation even if a complaint is not filed. So if they just hear of something happening, they have the authority to do that. They aren't out watching public meetings of all across the state. They're not, hopping on the Zoom and just checking to see, hey, is this district following public meeting law? But if they hear of something, or something, especially if something comes through the media, they certainly can open up an investigation on their own merit. I've mentioned a couple of times the possibility for public meeting lawsuits. Again, we don't see these very often. We don't anticipate seeing more of them. But it is important to note
that was fresh.
the court can order the governing body to redo the decision in a public meeting, and can order payment, appropriate equitable relief, payment of attorney's fees, and those types of things. Anytime something goes to court, it does cost a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. So if you can avoid it, that can be very helpful for you. So following the complaint procedures, the grievance that might come to you, and allowing it to go up to OGEC, and doing your best to fully respond to those types of grievances can be really helpful in reducing the potential for a lawsuit long-term. And I think with that, we've gotten through all of the content that we've planned. I don't know, we are short on time. I don't know if Haley and Therese, if you've saved any questions that you wanted to answer live, or if we want to hand it right back to Janet Avila Medina to close us out.
So Janet, why don't you go through following up with questions? And then I think there was a request to go back to the slide that board members can take a picture of to evidence that you attended this. So I was going to go back to that slide. And then I think we should just wrap it up. We'll follow up. Somebody asked about the chat. A couple of people asked about capturing the chat. We're going to create an FAQ of the questions that were in the chat and kind of more thoroughly answer those questions in an FAQ. And then we will send those out to you all as well and have those available as a resource for our members, because great questions.
Oh, go Bulldogs! Did you see that last shot? Man, that was fantastic! Oh, that was terrific. Oh, yeah. Man, there's nothing like winning a game in the final second, and I love it when the crowd gets behind our team. Finally.
I know, but I almost feel sorry for that poor guy who had the ball stolen away from him.
Oh, yeah, but we all get over things like that. You know, I'm just glad that the four of us could get together and go to the game. It's nice to get to visit outside of a board meeting. You know, I feel like I know each of you a little bit better.
Yeah, no angry parents, no pressure, no tough decisions. We really need to do this more often.
But you know, we probably would have lost that game if Mark wouldn't have come back in so pumped up. Did you notice that? Did you notice the assistant coach giving him that pep talk? I gotta tell you, I'm worried about Dr. Wilson's proposal that we cut 3 assistant coaches next year. I don't know.
Well, I'm just glad we won.
Yeah, but the point is, if we cut the assistant coaches, there might not be anybody to motivate Mark like that. I don't know if this position is one of the ones Dr. Wilson wants to cut. But I'm opposed to it if that's the case. I'll
Oh,
tell you.
I'm with Andy on this. We're gonna have to make cuts. And we are going to. I don't think those are the positions that I would take out of the budget. I'm
No.
sure we've got some office staffers or some cafeteria workers that can go first.
Hey, nobody likes the cafeteria food anyway, right? I know Ted wants us to leave it all to Dr. Wilson, but we all know that's a mistake. Bill, you agree with me, don't you? And Monica and Hazel, what do you think?
It's going to come down to instructional staff or non-instructional staff cuts.
Right.
He said we needed to find about $250,000 in payroll savings, didn't we? We could find that with non-instructional staff. That's what I'd be for.
And I think we ought to go to Dr. Wilson and tell him that we want the cuts to come from non-instructional staff, period. I'd volunteer to do it, but Bill, you've got a lot better relationship with him. Would you tell him what we've decided?
Are we even supposed to be talking about this? I mean, after all, it's not a meeting. And neither Ted nor Dr. Wilson, not to mention the cafeteria staff, has any idea that we're even thinking about this. I don't feel good about it.
Oh, come on, Hazel. We here are a majority. We know what we want. We just saw more evidence tonight that we're right. Now, it comes down to us to decide the basis of how the cuts are made. It is our policy. And we want the cuts to be made to non-instructional staff, right?
I do agree with that.
And I don't know why we just don't go to Dr. Wilson and tell him what we want. You think about it, we're going to save him all that embarrassment of us sniping at his proposal in a public meeting, and it'll save us a whole lot of time.
I don't know about that, Andy.
Oh, I can see the endless conversation we're going to have at that board meeting, huh? Ted on one side, the rest of us on the other. We're doing Dr. Wilson a favor if we decide now, so he doesn't waste time preparing a presentation we're going to shoot down anyway.
It just doesn't seem right for us to be making this decision at a basketball game.
Hazel, we are the board. This is a policy decision, and a majority of us set the policy, not the board president, not the superintendent. We do not have to defer to them. You know, it is okay to stand up for what we believe, huh?
No, we was the one with the white hair
Walk away
Yeah, that's
and
the.
report it,
and walk away,
and report it.
report it. Who do you report it to?
Whoever's in the line of. It depends on whoever, what doctor or whatever is the chair. You go through that, if it gets kicked out, then you go up to the commission.
So let's practice using some of the words that we put in the public meeting law, will this be a grievance or a complaint?
Reasons.
And the grievance needs to be filed, whatever that process is that we put on the website, right? Okay. I'm not gonna go through this, but I really want to go through, so what are the risks of discussing that board business outside of those notice meetings? The public can't weigh in on them?
It also just gives, like, if anyone's walking around leaving, what are those 4 board members talking about?
Like, they talk about social gatherings are fine, but
Mhm.
we have to think about like the perception, like, we know that that's fine, but not everybody sits through that training and knows that that's fine, and they see 4 board members, which is how this originally came up, somebody saw 4 board members at a barbecue, and they were like, oh, why are they at the barbecue, what are they talking about, they no business, you know? And that can turn into a report directly to OJC, because if people don't know what the process is to come to the board first and get a grievance, so that you can sit there and say, no, this, you know, a violation didn't occur, they might go straight to OJC if they see it. And then you're gonna have to deal with the repercussions of them coming in to examine that. One of the ways you sometimes avoid it when we talk about trainings or we talk about social gatherings is to do a quorum notice. And that's basically just have the board secretary put out a notice that we're gonna be all attending this barbecue on this date. We're not gonna be talking about any more business. We're not gonna talk about anything. It's just a social gathering or it's a training session, like when we go to our conventions and stuff like that. You can always put that out there because it's just the next step. It's another step you can take and be transparent with the public. Be like, we're gonna be together. If you see us at the restaurant, we're not holding a meeting. And we know we're not supposed to be talking about things that are related to board decisions or future decisions. And then once you're there in those meetings, we're getting those conversations. If he starts talking about it, hey, that is a public meeting violation. Maybe just say it to the person right there. We need to stop talking.
What about things that we're invited to for the district? So like the in-service luncheons. Or
and I think they cover that in the public meeting law, that those are social gatherings, or maybe a site visit because you want to go see something that, the news.
Junior high.
Yeah. Those things, I always, as a board secretary, just err on the side of what's it gonna look like, especially in a small town. You wanna make sure that you just say, hey, these people are gonna be here, but this has nothing to do with decisions that we're making. And just kind of put it out there. And then if people do say, no, well, I overheard, and if you are talking about stuff, that could be an issue. So
you're saying notify Julie if we plan on meeting?
Usually if you're going to a training or if you're invited by the school, it might be a good idea to be like, hey, you know, I know 4 of us or 5 of us, 4 among 9. 4 among 9 is 5? Okay, so 5 of us are gonna be attending this and then just notify Julie. Like, if you're not all planning on attending or it wasn't a school invite, then yeah, I think that communication would be helpful. Just, hey, I've been invited to this, Julie. I just don't know if any other board members are going.
Can we have a quorum for, so like during the pandemic, we had listening sessions. We kept it, I think, the maximum of 3 board members, but like I said, it was a listening session, get feedback from the public.
So with when that was happening during COVID, the public meeting laws changes since then. Would say that listening session is a public meeting because it's a meeting of potential quorum of the board, or it is a quorum of the board. And if you wanted to leave it to 2 or 3, there's one of the other things that they mentioned about any subcommittees or advisory committees or, you know, of the board that can have 2 members. So with those changes, that made it okay then?
Okay.
Just to follow up on, so I agree with Dale, you know, you see something like that happening and then you would file the grievance. If the grievance goes to the school, whoever that person might be.
The chair or the CEO, the superintendent.
And if it makes it onto the agenda, it's listed as a grievance or a complaint?
It should be listed as a grievance.
A grievance.
Based on what Spencer was saying.
Because it's a local grievance as opposed to an complaint. Okay. Thank you for the clarification.
And I think that's against the governing body specifically, not like complaints that go, you know, through your normal KL process. If you have a KL process, like if somebody has a complaint about a teacher.
Right, something about the board.
So that,
Yep.
that's okay. The complaint against the public body itself. Okay?
Thank you.
So how can board members maintain healthy relationships without crossing into that decision making? Because if they're like, well, this is great, we get to see each other outside of, you know, normal business, we're here at the game, we're celebrating. So how can you do that and not cross those relationships? Well, there's public meetings. Have those relationships without crossing the public meeting law. Yeah.
Answer seems like it's in the question, just don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think actually you already said that, when I'm saying earlier, you just walk away or you just make that notice. Because it's okay to have those social gatherings and to have time and training and experience and networking and lunches when you're at things. But just make sure that you yourself as individual board members keep in mind when is what I'm gonna say, gonna take us over into a different category than just a social gathering.
So I know that this was based on, there was a quorum because there were 4 of them.
Correct.
But what if you're a member of a board and it's just you and someone from the board comes up and just talks to you about something? So it's not a quorum, but they're talking to you about something with regard to the board. What do you do?
That's a really good question as far as like, what do you do?
Caution them not to create a serial meeting verbally.
Yeah.
By email or by text.
So it's one thing to have a conversation between 2 people, but if you're gonna involve anyone else who might be making the decision and they might be sharing possibly that, oh, so-and-so and I were talking about this. What's your opinion? Or I just want to let you know that this is what we're thinking. So if you share that with that third board member, you don't know, like at that point, that third board member could share it with another board member. So I think that's the really thing we need to think about, is that if you're having this conversation, it's just making sure that that stays between those two board members.
And like you already stated, you have to have a meeting. Or you're breaking.
And even if the conversation between one or two board members is kind of leaning towards, okay, we're starting to kind of talk about or deliberate on something that we're gonna need to be talking about on the board. You have to think about, like, should the public be hearing what I'm thinking? Should the public be knowing that I'm questioning this? Should the public be knowing my concerns? Yes. So make sure that those conversational items come up at a public meeting, because you want that transparency too, where you're like, hey, I'm your representative. I am thinking about these things. I'm not just rubber stamping stuff, or I'm not just saying no just to be combative. I am actually thinking these are my concerns. And you can even say, you know, I was talking with one other board member. That's not a public meeting violation. I was talking about it, and these are some of the things that we were thinking of. I want to bring it to, you know, the board to talk about. Let's discuss this during our deliberation. I also highly recommend, for the preservation of that relationship with your superintendent at the board, that you bring them in on there as well, because if there's a potential that you're asking questions, that you're going to need information brought to you, then make sure that the staff or the superintendent can bring that information to you to relay your concerns or to answer that question, so that there's no surprises that they need to. That's just, you know, that's what we talk about when we want to have that superintendent and board relationship. We want to keep it trustworthy, and you want to make sure it's a positive relationship. So what is the superintendent's role versus the board role of budget recommendations? Because that's what the top of the conversation here. This talks a little bit more about the board versus superintendent roles. No.
No, I think we need to Sean. Sorry.
So I'm talking about budget decisions. What's the superintendent versus the role of the board?
We don't really make decisions on the budget. I mean, the budget committee that makes these decisions, and then the superintendent's the one that enforces the budget. And I guess for me, my opinion is we're the final say if there's something that needs to be talked about.
I think as far as the board's role is that you're gonna approve that budget. Right. So that's the only thing that you're gonna do, but you're also gonna probably deliberate that. There's gonna be a public hearing on that budget. You're gonna have conversations. You're gonna have public citizens coming in that can comment on that budget too, that you'll be listening to. So there is a decision that's going to be made, and there might be parts of that budget that the board will be talking about later, like a line item that, you know, we want to talk about that we're concerned. Yes, the budget committee advised us to pass this, but I have concerns about this, and I want to talk about that in a public meeting rather than talking about that here. And that's just kind of that idea of, like, we want to make sure that those discussions, concerns, questions that you as a board are supposed to be having oversight on that budget. Yes, the budget is created by the superintendent and staff, but you're going to be ultimately approving it. So not line by line detail micromanaging, but overall, if there's some concerns about a specific issue, you're going to probably be talking about that. And it could weigh in on whether or not you approve the budget as is or with an amendment.
Yeah, see, the discussion they were having, they could have had in an open meeting.
Yes,
As deliberation.
absolutely. And that's what we want to avoid, having deliberation. Outside of that notice meeting where the public can come in and listen to what you're saying and also, you know, have them. Okay. So basically, key concepts here is that open meeting laws exist to protect that transparency. We want that board unity. It requires those decisions to be made in only in posted meetings, because there's only 4 people there. Obviously, that's a quorum. There's no other board members who are not being privy to this conversation. The superintendent should not be directed outside of official process. So the board only makes decisions. That's the way you direct the superintendent. I think he was mentioning something in there about telling the superintendent what we think that he should do with the budget. You can't do that as individual board members. You can't even do that as, you know, for majority unless made as a decision in an open public meeting. Then that authority that the board has decided together with that 4 person majority, then that becomes the directive for which the superintendent follows. All right, here's another step.
Before we close the meeting, I just want to wish all of you and your families the happiest of holidays. We all hope nothing but the best for all of us and for our students and their families during the new year. Any further discussion before I call the meeting to a close? I'm sure we all hope nothing but the best for all of us and for our students and their families during the new year. Any further discussion before I call the meeting to a close?
Well, I'm sure the holidays will be all happier for y'all since you got your cookie bouquets from Acme Heating and Air Conditioning.
What do you mean? You got one too, did you?
I sure did. And I sent it right back along with the note that says I do not accept bribes.
Brian,
Amy, what in the world are you talking about? You know perfectly well what I'm talking about. I told y'all at the time, I didn't think Acme was the best vendor for these renovations. And I didn't like the way they did business. I didn't appreciate old Sam trying to court me before we awarded that contract, like boat could be bought.
And he was just trying to make sure we all understood what was included in the bid. And anyway, that job is over and done with. Acme came in on time and under budget, just like they did on the previous project. We're just trying to wish us a happy holiday.
I know a bride when I see one, and I'll bet that all y'all will remember these cookie bouquets next time we have a big HVAC job that needs to get done.
And I haven't said that. There's no way a fifth cookies are gonna influence my thinking on awarding a contract.
Sure can say that now, but I guarantee.
I'm going to call this conversation to a close. We're not supposed to discuss this matter. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right. Thoughts? Can you give some examples of some small gifts in education and whether they can influence your decision? Other than this one. Is there any that are heard here? Receive gifts as board members? Is it even?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Holy Church
Holy Church.
every year.
And we all got a T-shirt from Foster Elementary when we were in elementary schools.
Well, I missed that.
I bet they have enough.
You want to talk a little bit about what is that fine line between like that courtesy and whether or not you can accept that gift or not that's given to you as your, in your official capacity as a public official.
Dollar amount,
Hmm?
there's a dollar amount for one.
There is a dollar amount. Important to
Was it,
remember.
50?
Do they have an administrative or legislative interest in the decision?
What was that? I didn't hear.
Do they have a legislative or administrative interest in any decision that you're gonna make?
Well, in like Holly Church, though, they actually support all staff, all elementary, all, I mean, I think clear across the board, every teacher, every principal, everyone.
So you're not getting it just because you're.
Right.
Yeah.
You're also not getting it because we pay Holly Church to do whatever.
Right.
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 That was the legislative or administrative interest. There is one.
Yeah.
Good things just to think about, you know, whether or not board members should accept gifts from vendors in this situation. It doesn't sound like maybe what this situation was. It's unclear with the video as far as.
So that one's kind of iffy.
Yeah, because they were talking about how they did hire them to do something, but then the board member said that they're already done with the work. So is this really affecting a decision?
So then I guess my question would be then how do you view that? Because if it's iffy, you know, I think we could all sit here and say, I mean. Should you accept it? Shouldn't you accept it because it's over? But then the influence on using them the next time, like you think about the cookie. I don't know.
Or maybe it's all mine, I don't know.
But do you have a suggestion on that?
I don't because I'm not aware, but I would say. These are things that do come up and we really want you to kind of think about those. And if you have a concern and you do receive a gift in a situation similar to this and you're concerned, then what would be your first step? Maybe reaching out to your district attorney and be like, you know what, can this in any way, shape or form be considered, you know, the bride? Should this be considered receiving this, could that be looking in a poor light on the board members? And maybe that's a discussion that needs to be happening with the vendors. Yes, they did it on their own time and they did this stuff, but you might want to have that conversation before it's even arranged through staff to have it delivered to the board. You know what I mean? Maybe that conversation happens before it gets to board members, and board members don't necessarily have to be the one saying, I can't accept this. Maybe it's through the administration process, or maybe there is a policy or something that you developed that says, you know, what is our stance on accepting gifts? Do we have exceptions? That kind of thing. So it's things that you want to have conversations about if you think it's going to be an issue, and then you might even want to call somebody and say, hey, OGC, you know, would this be considered a violation if we accept this gift? Or is there a potential conflict by accepting this gift? And maybe talk through that and see what their perspective is on it, and then that can talk, or that can determine how the board discusses that and address accepting gifts.
With all these facelifts that we've done in the school, has something like this comes to attention where there's gifts been given from contract? I mean, I know that's one scenario, but like, we've done a lot of construction the last 10 years. No,
Most places know that public officials really can't receive, especially anything over $50. But sometimes there's gift cards and things that go around. I know that there's been some scenarios about, dinners being provided to the board, and I know that OGC has made some statements about that. Are you receiving that dinner? Is that expense that you don't have to pay because of your role as a public official? There are ways to get like to make that okay, where you have to have it as part of your policy or part of your compensation package as board members, that it's part of your stipends or that have been approved. But these are discussions to think about. If you don't have a policy, you don't have, when these issues come up, because they will you be violating something? Will you get yourself in trouble by not having a clear process for your new board members coming on who don't know? You know what I mean? Maybe you've never had these kinds of conversations and they're not sure if they can or they can't. And then maybe they do accept that and then find out, oops, I shouldn't have done that. It was over $50. Or, you know, I didn't know that they were going to be coming up and have to be involved in the future decision that we we're going to make on awarding them.
I think that HVAC company does have an administrative or legislative interest, which is the language that the statute uses. In the future decisions of the board, if the board puts something out to bid and they're in the future, I think arguably you could get yourself in trouble. And the same for public employees. Josh can't be being taken out to dinner. You know, it's or elected officials, it's cumulative, it adds up. They might take you to dinner, cost $20, and the next time $20, and the third time the $20 dinner puts you in violation. When you read OGEC's opinions.
And that's a good point, is that maybe read up on it.
But that's what differs in my mind, the HVAC contractor from Holly Church. Holly Church doesn't have a legislative or administrative interest in any decision. So.
But they may in the future.
No,
Yeah.
I don't think so.
and,
Sorry, I have to
I
go
think
back
that's
to
probably,
and they do it
probably
like
stretch.
Jenna said, they do it for every single,
classified.
employee.
teacher, every,
So,
yeah.
yeah, the bus.
That is a specific situation where.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
But how.
it could still get people in trouble because it's depending on the amount of the, whatever, the value, because as a.
$10, just so you know, for this year.
Yeah, I know. As
No, though.
As an employee at LB, I can't, I'm under the same things, just as an employee.
Most important from. Yeah, I don't know.
I've never used this. I've gotten it every year and I've never used it because I've been afraid.
Sorry, but I do. I know.
So,
These
so
are the
what,
kinds of
what,
conversations. Are you receiving a financial benefit as your role of a public official that others may not? Are you handing these out to everyone? So those are things to think about.
so what's a staff sports pass cost if somebody off the street wants to come and buy one? Not, no, I mean, if Joe that lives down the street on the corner wants to get into every Husky sports, you know, he wants one of these sports passes, what does Joe pay?
I don't know.
Can't.
That there is. a sports service. There's not a source of sports.
I think like how much per
You
game.
can play pay per
basically.
family, there's like family deals and stuff like that,
Like what's its value?
Not wanting to get anybody in trouble, but these are the kinds of things that you might not be thinking about until you saw the scenario. So that's kind of what we're doing, just to think about these things that do happen and really evaluate the things that you are willing to accept and maybe talk to that as a board. Okay, this is something that we can because it's not any influence. But am I getting a monetary financial benefit?
Or avoidance of financial detriment
Or
because of
avoiding
money.
financial detriment because I'm serving on the board and this is not being made available to anyone other than.
We went through it once before, and I can't remember what was decided. I mean, as far, because it was basically like a senior pass was the same thing.
Is it part of your package as being a board member? Is it within the budget? Like, you know what I mean? Because.
To support the students.
So how do these small gestures influence the public's perception? Like Annie was saying, I know a bribe when I see one. Now, not everybody else thought of it that way, but he felt that way. So is he feeling he's being bribed to vote a certain way in the future, potentially? So if he's thinking that, and he says it in a board meeting, what's the public gonna think about that too? Considering perceptions of not just your own, not just an individual board member, not just the board, not just the district, but think about the perceptions who are out there in your district too, and the things that they're gonna see.
So we have that policy.
If you have it in policy, that's great. If you don't, maybe look at it. You know, see if that's actually in there, if there's something in there, or if something needs to be updated. These are the kinds of things as a board that you want to recognize and then maybe review your policies. Maybe we need an update here. So the key concept that even small gifts can damage public trust. Clear policy is needed to define acceptable versus unacceptable. So if you don't currently have that, maybe a discussion needs to happen. Perception of bias is harmful. It is as harmful as actual. It may not be an actual bias that you receiving this gift is going to influence your future, but perception is key. Couple more, just to kind of get the think tanks going.
Hey, glad I ran into you. Hey, once I'm with the school board. The entire board, I'm surprised.
Yeah.
At our, is that 40-year levels, very well at the top. How can the school board stand by on that Hank Fisher meeting?
That one, just check and see that all. Okay.
Same thing.
Welcome. Hey, Diane, it's Andy. You're finishing up okay. And to the high school back. 99. Yeah. I've gotten a number of high school.
I'm gonna reroute. See if this has something to do with. Pull it right off that file.
This is Diane Walker. Hey, Diane, it's Andy. Hope I'm not bothering you. Oh, no,
just here finishing up some loose ends at the office. I have to get ready to go to the high school basketball game tonight.
Ah,
How can I help you, Eddie?
I've gotten a number of calls about the high school girls basketball coach.
What about her?
Well, it seems like the best players aren't getting to play.
Well, I sort of believe that being up to the coach.
It looks to me like we may have a real case of favoritism.
Favoritism?
Yeah, favoritism. The 5 girls who always start go to the First Community Church, and that's the same church that the coach attends.
Well, that's a really big church. Don't you think it could be a little bit of a coincidence?
I don't know. I've been trying to reach the principal of the school where she coached last year to see if she's done this kind of thing before. But my question for you, Diane, what are you gonna do about this situation?
Sorry, I'm trying to avoid it all. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. Outline a chain of command for staff concerns in your district. So if something like this came up, what would be the board members appropriate?
We would contact the principal,
Contact their principal
and he probably.
as an individual board member.
Yeah, he probably just opened himself up to a lawsuit from the coach when he contacted the previous employee.
Yeah.
And he may have not only opened himself up, but the school district.
What's the board's role when community concerns involve staff performance?
Go up the chain. Advise them to work the way up the chain. It's not you as a board member's responsibility.
Is it the board member as a whole? Is it their responsibility about staff performance or
It can be, yeah.
when it comes to discipline, right? And if that complaint is made later to the board. But in general, who's responsible for hiring and firing? Terry?
Sure.
This is a little bit of board micromanagement and also not the, it's our overreach. Yeah.
It's okay as a board member just to talk to principals and staff, right? As long as you're not talking about like something like that, right?
Well, what you need to think about is that your one employee is the superintendent. Principals are the superintendent's employees. And as a board member, when you approach and talk about staffing and certain performance issues with a, say, a principal at the high school, how are they perceiving you as a board member coming in and talking to them about those things?
Well, then I have a question. I had to go to my son's principal because there were issues with things that happened.
So in this situation, you're a board member, you've only been a board member.
Just don't lie.
When this happened, were you as a parent only?
Yes, it was this week.
Okay. So when you went to talk to them, did you say anything like, I would like to meet with you. I'm coming in to talk to you as a parent, not as in my official capacity as a board member.
No, I didn't say anything about being in the official capacity. I said,
But did you schedule that meeting with them?
no, I had a concern, and so I waited outside and she was able to get me in.
And this concern was regarding a teacher in the classroom?
It was regarding a counselor I did not want my son to see.
So what's the complaint process with that? Do you know?
Go to the principal first, right?
No, you go to the person first, then if nothing happens, then the principal. So if it's teacher,
So the complaint process, you're right, it is according to KL, the complaint process is that you first try to resolve it with a teacher or counselor. That's the first step.
So
if you don't feel comfortable, with that, like either over email or whatever the issue is, bringing the issue to their attention so they have an opportunity to respond. If you don't feel comfortable with that, then the next step is to their administrator in the building. And so, yes, you would make an appointment and say, I want to talk about this, with you, about this employee and this situation that I'm having. At that point, whatever the resolution is from the principal, that would be the end. If you don't like the principal's resolution, then the next step in the complaint process would be to take it to the superintendent.
There was no complaint.
Okay.
It was a I don't know this lady, my son has enough trauma, I don't want her pulling my son in until I get to know her. My mom was a pediatric trauma nurse. Everyone's a weirdo, everyone's out to hurt your kid, it just is what it is. So I informed the principal that I do not want my son being pulled in specifically.
Okay, now, I get what you're saying, and as a parent, you have the right to do that.
Absolutely.
But what you have to also think about is that the perception of you being a public official as well is also somebody who is responsible for making decisions for the district, not necessarily whether or not this person is, and I'm not talking about the details of that. So you just need to think about this kind of interactions where you could be perceived as their boss because you are a board member, but you're not. But it's
I don't know
that authority. They think that, you know, as a staff member, it's best for them to talk to the person that they're supposed to directly report to as far as it's situations making decisions about if that staff stays on or not. That's not what you were talking about, but it's just, it's something I want you to think about. And when you have different hats to wear, that you want to show up in a way that kind of says, I'm not speaking in my capacity as a board member. This is solely as a parent, and I want to discuss these concerns about my student, and I have the right to do that. But also making sure that you're going through the process just like anybody else would, if there.
Oh, yeah.
And if that's what you did, because you didn't feel comfortable going to the counselor, so you went to.
Well, because there's nothing to complain about. I don't know you. I don't want you potentially putting things into my already traumatized kid's head. He seeks counseling. So I just don't want you to pull him in, was all that it was. And
really, it's just a matter of thinking about, like, you're not serving in your official capacity as a board member, because
Correct.
board members would not be making those suggestions about how, you know,
Correct.
the parents. So just keeping that in mind and making sure that you're aware that that is, you know, the story that's going into, is that you have to just kind of keep. They say oftentimes that you want to kind of announce, if you're going to say something, that you say, I am not representing the board when I say this, you know, that kind of thing. I know it's different in small towns with parents. There's something to be mindful of, that your interactions with anyone within the district, that you are seen as a person of authority, and potential any of those conversations that happen, even if it's regarding your student and as a parent, will they think that it's possible that it will create some sort of anxiety that, you know, you as a board member are going to go above them, even though you said we're going to complain. Are you going to go to the superintendent and complain about, you know, the principal then, because the principal isn't satisfied with what you get to do? You see what I'm saying?
so one, it's a brand new principal. I talked to her day one. I don't think she knows I'm a school board member. She might, but I don't know. Two, so you want me to go to the counselor and say, hey, I don't know you, I think you're a weirdo.
I don't say I want you to do that. What I'm saying is, as a board member and a parent, I want you to be aware of what potential interactions could be and how it could be perceived by others, and then make your decisions as far as how you're going to proceed with that in that manner. Make sure that you're following the complaint procedure, and if that complaint procedure says to go to the council first, and you do not feel comfortable in the situation doing that because you don't think that it's not a complaint, but it is something that you want to talk about as far as this person, so that needs to be taken to the person who hired them. And if that's not resolved with the person who hired them, and that person doesn't have any say in that, then it needs to go up the chain. And just being aware that there is a chain, that there is a process, that there is a way to do that. And maybe the board needs to have discussions about how board members who are also parents, you know, will handle that situation. What's the best communication protocol for these kinds of situations? Have those discussions, see if it's in policy, read the policy on it, and make sure that you're following as far as your board authority.
So I have a question. And this might get me in my own hot lava, but I mean, I'm the PTC president for my kids' school. I'm there all the time. I do fundraising for the school all the time, not in board capacity, but in elementary funding for baseball teams, for booster. I mean, I'm a part of all of that on a constant basis. So I'm speaking with the principals in their office. I'm at the schools, like I'm doing all of those things.
In the capacity of the parent-teacher
Right.
organization, yes.
Okay.
Okay, and that's all I want you to think about, is that your visit and what the purpose of your visit for being in the school is, because you're volunteering in this role.
Right.
And that's the hat you're wearing at that time. If he's aware that you're coming into there, but you're walking around, other teachers may see that they may not know why you're there. If they know you're a board member, And maybe there's something that happened, they could be like, oh, you know, are you coming to talk to me about that situation? So just be mindful of those conversations. And when you're there, just the perception is that you are some authority in the district, not necessarily on whether people are hired or not. Or dismissed, that you ultimately might. If it comes up to the board, you have that, but you as an individual, you have to be aware of the different hats you're wearing. And just make sure that if you're taking both of those hats into the building, which one are you wearing, and making sure that everything's there. Hey, I'm here as a PTO, I've got this activity going on today.
So do you want us stating that, hey, I'm here as a parent every time?
No, I'm just saying that, not necessarily, because it may not be appropriate to say.
Well,
I'm here as a
yeah.
parent, but these are things I want you to think about. I don't think there's any hard fast rule unless you have a policy. So if there is a policy, make sure where that policy and what the procedures are for that. Like, do you need to notify the principal before you come into the building? Those kinds of things, if that's in policy. I'm not saying it is, but you just want to read and see what your role and how that could have conflicts and how you're going to mitigate those conflicts when you're going into the schools.
So I just want to clarify, it sounds like you're saying is you're a parent or you're a community member or whatever, but you're also on the school board. So anytime that you're out there talking to anybody in the public, including staff, is if it ever starts going towards something that could either be on a complaint form or something that's going to come before the board, that's when you have to make sure that you tell them, right, clarify.
Yeah.
Right.
Listen.
I'm a member of the board
Yes.
or in regard to a complaint, I'm putting on my mom hat
Mhm.
and I'm submitting this complaint as a mom.
And then if that complaint gets all the way up to the board because you're not satisfied with that, then you're gonna have to recuse yourself as
Right.
the board member when
Right.
that comes up. So
Right.
Okay.
just being mindful of where it's going or where it potentially go in the future, making sure that you're being clear and transparent about what's going on in that situation.
Is there a policy for us?
Yes.
Where I see this going astray is when someone says, well, you know, they hear that this and so is me or whatever. And then you shift from being a parent now more to a board member. Well, I want to go in and see Dale teach. That's where the difference is. Going in to talk about your child, you're a parent.
Right.
You know, you don't leave that responsibility at the door. What Jen is saying is you just have to think those other things. As far as thinking someone doesn't know who you are. The folks that are here as candidates. The administrators will know tonight who's elected to the board. When you look at the organizational chart, you've got the board on top. Below that is me. Below that is principals, directors, employees. So whether it's real or perceived, the power of a board member is what floats in session. But what Jen's saying is you don't take that hat off when you go into a building.
Just be aware that it's always gonna be more. Not because you want to be wearing it and because you're there for that specific thing, but how others are gonna perceive. And just be aware of that as you have your interactions, just to remain in your parent role. And yeah, that's all. There's not like a true instruction for it, which is hard. But that's why we have the scenarios, so you can kind of think about these things, and if you think ahead about how you're gonna react in certain situations, then you're better prepared, and you know if there's a policy or not before you go in. I know, it's a lot for board members. I'm going to try for one more, just because I think it's good to have these conversations. And just be thinking about the different things and what responsibilities come with being a board member.
Can I ask a quick question about perception?
Yeah.
You mentioned Holy Church. Can I ask how many members attend Holy Church?
Contrary to popular belief.
Yep, I've been there for 13 years. So, yeah.
All right. I'm gonna do one more.
There wasn't even pre-existing board members before that attended, was there?
No.
Yeah, I didn't.
We're now,
Hold on. I'm gonna move this over. All right, this will be the last.
of the agenda where we are to evaluate, performance of the superintendent.
Well, this is doing great.
Okay, so.
12 and
Files are put up.
we're running championship, and the teachers all really like him.
Well, Andy, this is a little bit.
And that's the one that's on the website?
No, these aren't on the website, these are files, and the files, it's not. I'm not sure the files. We also had to transfer them over to. SharePoint, and I've been noticing that things on SharePoint is
Yeah.
causing some problems. I apologize. I can't even vote off somewhere else. You know what? Okay, that's it. Let's just go ahead and see if there's any questions that have come up for you as we've been kind of going through public meeting laws and different scenarios. Is there anything that you'd like to share or like further clarification? I can go over it. If I can't answer it, then I'm done. Like, I'm not able to answer it. I know, it's a lot. I know. That's what I said, it's the fire hose.
Well, I'm careful with that. I'm part of the fire department too.
But I'd like to make a comment.
Yeah.
Thank you to the three of you for showing up on. I think that is fantastic that you took 3 hours of your time to come here, even though you're not even part of the board. I find that highly commendable. Yep.
Agreed. Did you find it public or did it completely scare you off?
As all of a sudden you can see them going.
So when you're going to us. I did, like you said, I learned something. How many of you who are serving on board currently, you would have had some of that training before? Do you think it would have changed?
Yes.
That's
Probably.
We really just want you to be informed. We want you to be thinking about these things, having these conversations. If you have questions, to reach out to us. And if I can't answer it because I'm not a lawyer, we do have lawyers available to us. We can answer those questions to make sure you don't get into situations.
Sometimes.
Oh, we're there, they're just not always, not busy. So, I just want to make sure that you're aware of that, and we do have resources available to you. There's lots of things on our member resource page on our portal that has some of the webinars and different things that we go through, and we periodically will put those on our conventions as well. Is anyone planning on going to convention in November? Is that something that you think about? You usually go to summer board. I know some of you went to summer board. Next year, we won't be doing summer board, we'll be doing, summer sessions, we'll be going out to the state in different areas. I think Eugene and Redmond are one of the two one day, we're trying to make it less expensive and not have to have people spend the night as much, so it can provide an opportunity to get out there. Yeah.
I just had a quick, I'm just going through what I wrote down.
Sure.
So you mentioned, or I think the presentation mentioned documents added to minutes. Sorry, this is my chicken scratch. Let me get my thoughts. Okay, so it said something about during a document must be added to the minutes if it's presented during a meeting.
Correct.
Okay.
So that becomes part of the meeting, like minutes and meeting records is kind of a hard thing to explain sometimes. But there's the minutes, which are the written record of the meeting, or according to OJC, it could be the video recordings or audio recordings if you have a waiver from the Secretary of State. So whatever those are that are your minutes, that's that actual document of saying, this is the time, this is where we met, this is what happened, these are the actions, these are the votes, this is what we recorded. Those elements that need to be in there, that's the minutes. But if there's a document that comes up, like for example, a presentation, then you would have that, if it's referred to in the meeting discussion, then that would be a document that you refer to in your meeting. OSBA presented a presentation on this.
Okay.
And so you're referring to it in the minute, and then it doesn't necessarily have to be cut and paste into that document there, but you're referring to it, so that needs to be part of the meeting record, so that if somebody's reading the minutes, you know this is that document, that they can go over into the meeting record, and they can find what document that you're referring to.
Like board packets.
Yes, the board packet that you received beforehand continues on, because then the minutes become part of that packet. Anything that's brought to the meeting or shared or discussed become part of that whole overall meeting record packet. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I know you have a very busy night ahead. Thank you for allowing me to come in here and have the time with you. And if anything else comes up, please let me know.
Thank you very much.